Find other great podcasts like this one at podmoth.network.
I'll go into your van, witchy woman.
I'm Neve from Ireland.
And I'm Emily, living in Chicago.
And we have never met in real life.
Fortunately, you don't need to live on the same continent to make a spooky podcast.
So that's exactly what we did. We created Rowan and Pine, our folklore, mythology, and spooky stuff podcast.
You can find us on your favorite platform, and we already have over 35 episodes ready to binge.
Don't forget the spooky shorts.
Right. We also have a bunch of short episodes if that's what you're into.
Come on, get spooky with us and frick yeah folklore.
Are you someone who loves the great outdoors, the smell of fresh pine trees, and the thrill of working with powerful tools? If so, then being a logger might just be the perfect fit for you. Being a logger isn't just a job, it's a way of life. It involves working in forests, cutting down trees, and processing them into timber. Loggers are known for their strength, skill, and bravery as they navigate through the rugged terrain and face the challenges of working with nature's giants. Likely one of the most important tools in a logger's arsenal is the chainsaw. This powerful cutting tool makes the job of felling trees and cutting timber much more efficient and effective. But the chainsaw wasn't originally invented to fell trees. Believe it or not, chainsaws were invented for use by doctors. Hello, dear listeners, and welcome back to another episode of the ODDentity Podcast, a proud member of the PodMoth Media Network, your foray into the weird, wonky, and sometimes downright spooky. This week, I reintroduce you to the humble chainsaw, a tool that is more than capable of felling an oak tree, but in its early form, could be just as effective during childbirth. Yep, childbirth. This is the second to last episode of the season. In the next episode, I sit down with the Wicked Wiccan sisters to talk ghost hunting shop and all things spooky. But for now, back to the childbirth/logging tool. A symphysiotomy is a surgical procedure where the cartilage of the pelvis is divided to widen the birth canal during childbirth. This technique is sometimes used as an alternative to a cesarean section, especially in cases where a natural birth is deemed risky. Symphysiotomy allows for a controlled and gradual widening of the pelvis, making it easier for the baby to pass through the birth canal. Despite its benefits, symphysiotomy is not as commonly practiced today, due to concerns about its potential long-term effects on the pelvic stability. It was a fairly common operation, and many women underwent the procedure. In my experience, chainsaws are great for a lot of things. They make short work of troublesome foliage and allow the user to quickly and easily tame any towering pine. But they weren't invented by a landscaper or a logger. You're likely familiar with the cesarean section. It's pretty common. Emperor Caesar enacted a law in the 15th century that ordered doctors to perform the procedure on dead or dying mothers in order to save the baby's life. It was rumored that it could save both mother and child. Apparently, a veterinarian had performed one on his wife and both parties pulled through, but people were still skeptical. The cesarean was an incredibly painful operation. In the 19th century, operations had become more hygienic, but it took far too long to make the incisions with scissors, or in some cases, just the doctor's hands. Without antibiotics or anesthetic of any kind, I'd personally want for that experience to go a whole hell of a lot quicker. While symphysiotomy can be life-saving in certain situations, it carries significant risks. The immediate complications include bleeding at the wound site, local infection, injury to the urethra or bladder, vaginal lacerations, and blood in the urine. Long-term complications include pelvic pain and instability, gait problems, stress incontinence, urinary incontinence, and viscovaginal fistula, a tract between the bladder and the vagina. In rare cases, osteomyelitis. Long-term walking difficulties and pain generally improve over time. However, due to these potential complications, symphysiotomy should only be carried out when there's no safe alternative, and it's advised not to repeat the procedure. From all that's interesting, quote, around 1780, Scottish doctors John Aitken and James Jeffrey came up with what they hoped would be a safer alternative to C-sections. Instead of cutting into the abdomen, they would cut into the mother's pelvis in order to widen the birth canal and remove the baby vaginally. But a sharp knife was often not fast and painless enough to perform this surgery safely, so Aitken and Jeffrey consequently envisioned a rotating blade that could cut through bone and cartilage, and thus the first chainsaw was born. Initially small enough to fit into a doctor's hand, the original chainsaw was more like a small serrated knife attached to a hand crank. This fact is kind of fascinating to me, given the prototype is generally larger than the finished product. Though it sped up the process of widening a laboring mother's birth canal, it too proved too dangerous for most doctors to attempt. However, Aitken and Jeffrey were not the only doctors of their era to innovate with medical chainsaws. About 30 years after Aitken and Jeffrey's invention, a German child named Bernhard Heine began experimenting with medical devices. He came from a medical family, and his uncle Johann Heine manufactured artificial limbs and orthopedic devices. And so he spent most of his childhood learning how to construct different orthopedic tools. End quote. Imagine Bernhard Heine sitting at his desk staring at a pile of bone saws and chisels. He was clearly a surgical MacGyver. Quote, while his uncle Johann focused on the technical side of orthopedics, Bernhard studied medicine. After gaining surgical training, he specialized in orthopedic surgery. That's when he saw a way to blend his medical training with his technical skills. In 1830, Heine invented the chain osteotome, a direct ancestor to modern chainsaws of today. Osteotomes, or tools used to cut bone, used to be chisel-like and hand-operated, but Heine added a chain to his crank-powered osteotome, creating a faster and more effective device. End quote. The process of symphysiotomy continued in other parts of the world, at least until the 1980s, but there were concerns about long-term effects on pelvic stability that had led to a decline on the procedure. The shift aimed to minimize the risk of complications related to pelvic stability in patients. Greater awareness among healthcare professionals and patients about the potential long-term effects contributed to a decreased prevalence. This shift also highlights the importance of informed decision-making and patient-centered care in contemporary medical practice. There were also many psychological impacts of symphysiotomies on women that could be pretty devastating. Trauma and PTSD were a big one. Many women continued to suffer from panic attacks, post-traumatic stress disorder, reliving the experience through nightmares, flashbacks, intrusive thoughts. Depression and anxiety, these mental health issues are common among survivors, with some women experiencing nervous breakdowns following the surgery. There was a loss of bodily autonomy. The procedure left many women feeling violated and stripped of their right to make decisions about their own bodies. Social isolation. Due to physical limitations and emotional trauma, some women had withdrawn from social activities and relationships. These psychological consequences extended to family dynamics. Many mothers experience bonding difficulties with their newborns, leading to emotional distancing in some cases. The disruption in their sexual lives was often permanent, sometimes resulting in marriage breakdowns. Some women never recovered from their experience. If you're squeamish, I'd recommend skipping ahead 20 seconds or so. If you'd like to hear this, stick around. What follows is a first-hand account of a symphysiotomy. Quote, I just remember being brought into a theater, and the place was packed with people. I wasn't told that was happening. I was screaming and being restrained. I couldn't see much except from them sawing. It was excruciating pain. I was just 27, and I was butchered. Cora, who was 17 when she gave birth to her first child in 1972, had a similar experience. I was screaming, "It's not working," in reference to the anesthetic. I said, I can feel everything. I saw him go and take out a proper hacksaw, like a wood saw, a half circle with a straight blade and a handle. The blood shot up to the ceiling, up onto his glasses, all over the nurses. Then he went to the table and he got something like a soldering iron and put it on me and stopped the bleeding. They told me to push the baby out. The baby must have been out before they burnt me. He put the two bones together. There was a burning pain. I knew I was going to die. Now a healthcare worker in Dublin, Mary underwent the procedure 30 years ago and still grapples with its effects. She describes the experience as mentally and physically devastating and reports ongoing issues with incontinence. Mary's story highlights the long-lasting trauma experienced by many survivors. The fear instilled by the procedure was so intense that she avoided follow-up care, telling her doctor that she was fine at her 6-week checkup. Quote, there was no way I was going back into the hospital, she explains. I was so frightened. I wasn't taking the risk that he would take me in again. End quote. If given the option between Heinz invention and some other tools available at the time, namely handsaws, chisels, and hammers, I think I'd choose the osteotome. Now, it wasn't until 1905 before the chainsaw was used for tree removal. We're better off, I think. The thought of having somebody attacking my nether region with a chainsaw, like they're sharpening a giant pencil, does not appeal. The history of the symphysiotomy serves as a stark reminder of the complex interplay between medical practices, religious beliefs, and societal norms. The controversial procedure, originally intended to save lives during difficult childbirths, had a lasting impact on countless women. The physical and emotional scars left by the symphysiotomy highlight the importance of ethical medical practices and informed consent in healthcare, and stories of women like Mary underscore the long-lasting effects of symphysiotomy and the importance of listening to patients' voices. That's it for this week, dear listeners. Tune in next time for more tales of the spooky, weird, and paranormal. Until then, stay spooky. The Identity Podcast is brought to you by host Janine Mercer, and the music was created using GarageBand. Find the Odd Pod on Instagram at Identity Pod and on Facebook as The Identity Podcast. A transcript of this episode will be available at theidentitypodcast.wordpress.com. Got a paranormal experience to share? Send those along to theidentitypodcast@gmail.com. If you liked what you heard, please take a moment to mash that subscribe button and leave me a 5-star review. And don't forget to tell your friends, family, and coworkers about this podcast. Every little bit helps.